MO. It is February 10th. I've started my reading in February. I have read quite a few books. It's time for another vlog style monthly reading wrap-up. These are wrap-ups that I do every month where I talk about the books that I'm reading throughout the month. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes about each book. I try to tell you something about it, if I liked it, what some of the themes were, if I think you should read it too. And I also try to talk about the books as closely after I've read them as possible. That's why I do vlog style monthly reading wrap-ups, because I know that if I talk about them, well, not always, but like I feel that if I talk about them too far away from when I've read them, you don't get as good or as fresh of a review. So the first book that I finished in February was No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. This is a Japanese modern classic, and Dazai was a young but prolific writer who wrote a lot of like auto fiction that really resonated with the Japanese population. So this book is auto fiction, and it is an epistolary novel, which you know I love an epistolary novel. It has a prologue where a person is discovering these diaries. He's looking at photos, and then it goes into the notebooks that he has. It talks about this man's life. I can't remember if the man is named or not, but it's all about his life from a young age and him growing up, and it's how this man who wrote the notebooks doesn't feel connected to the world, doesn't feel connected to his family, doesn't feel connected to humans in general, and he wonders how he got here since he is not entirely human. Then it kind of goes through his life as he feels this disconnect from society, as he feels this disconnect from the human race. We see his whole life story, and at the end we go back to the framing narrative, see the epilogue of how this man got the notebooks and why he got the notebooks. It was really interesting. I think it is definitely a little nebulous, it is definitely a little existential, and it's interesting that so many Japanese books kind of go along with this theme, this idea of not feeling human and not feeling part of society. And if you are not part of society, you must not be human. I haven't read these books, but I know that Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and there's a one by Yukio Mishima that follows similar themes and a similar topic, and there's some other books as well. Even I would say like Idle Burning by Rin Usami is similar to this. So it's a very interesting reoccurring theme in Japanese writing. I definitely want to read more of those other books that I mentioned. This book was written in 1958, and yeah, I thought it was really fascinating. I really loved it. I loved the style. I loved the closeness that you felt with our main character, even though he felt distant from everything and everyone else in his life. Fascinating story. Highly recommend. I started this in January for Japan in January, and I finished it in February. The next book that I finished in February was The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. This is a series of essays that Du Bois wrote over time, I believe, but it was published together in like the early 1900s, like 1903 or something. In these essays, Du Bois talks about the state of African Americans, of Black people in America after the Civil War. So a large chunk of this book is devoted to talking about the repercussions of the Civil War and the freedman policies that were put in place after the Civil War, and how those freedman policies didn't work due to racism and due to people coming up with new ways like Jim Crow laws and imprisonment to enslave Black people. So this one was really interesting. It's definitely like a seminal work of Black American history, and it definitely is an important read. But I think that W.E.B. Du Bois' writing style and the time at which it was written is like very, very flowery, like a very purple prose, a little bit hard to grasp. At times, Du Bois seems like he is trying to prove himself to be an intelligent and intellectual man and an intelligent and intellectual writer to the audience. I'm sure that at the time that was necessary because Black people did not have as many rights and did not have as many opportunities to write books and to accurately depict the history of Black Americans. Not that they do that much today either, but so this was hard to get through just because it was pretty hard to comprehend sometimes. There is another whole section about Booker T. Washington and how Du Bois disagrees with Booker T. Washington's policies on Black people in America. So that was really interesting because that was like a history that I didn't really know about. The vague history that I was taught or that I gleaned on Booker T. Washington was that he was a Black advocate and a notable historic figure, but it wasn't clear that he actually advocated for a type of enslavement in some ways and not for equal rights. Hey, stop it. Cats. Oh, cats. That Booker T. Washington actually advocated against equal rights for Black people in America, and that these two political figures had extremely different views. There's also some parts of this that are autobiographical about W.E.B. Du Bois and his life and how he came to be where he was when writing this, and also his family life and his dealing with a death of an infant son and his feelings on that, and how he at this time almost felt better that his son died, that he didn't have to grow up and experience racism and experience enslavement in one way or another, experience prejudice, experience redlining, experience segregation, experience inequality that Black people suffered at this time and still suffer today in America. So this one was really interesting. Definitely something that I would like to return to at some point, something that I could see myself revisiting, especially after having read more Black American history to be able to put this into better context. The next book that I finished in February is a reread, and that is Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a Afrofuturism sci-fi book about a young woman who leaves her family in Africa, in her small tribe, in her small village, to be able to go to university. She is a harmonizer. She's someone who uses like math and the harmony and the math of the universe to harmonize with different objects and different people and create harmony in her community. She is still quite young, and her father is a master harmonizer, so she's kind of expected to take over for him, but she sneaks away to go to this college. People from her culture like never do this, never leave the village. So it's very taboo that she's doing it, but she feels like this is really the correct path for her. When she gets on the ship to travel to this other planet where the university is, the ship is attacked by enemy aliens of a different race, and they basically kill everybody on the ship, and she has to survive. So the first story, Binti, is all about her survival on the ship, her kind of finding her powers as a harmonizer within this story. I reread this one so that I could read Binti Home, which is the second in the series, and this follows Binti after the events of the first book when she reaches the university, when she has befriended but almost more like trauma bonded with one of the aliens from the ship that had taken over the ship and almost killed her in the first book, in Binti, and how she really feels that all these things that she's done and the trajectory of her life since leaving home has left her needing to cleanse herself and needing to return to her home so that she can perform some cleansing rituals in her own village and in her own place. So she goes back to her village, to her place, takes leave from the university, and her friend, family from this alien race goes with her. And that brings up a bunch of things because these are like mortal enemies of her home planet and her home place, and not her tribe, not her people, but people who live close to her who are also oppressive to her people have a real beef with these aliens. So what's gonna happen. And Binti Home ends with her having kind of learned again more about herself, having gone through this kind of cleansing process, ceremony, that she didn't even know what to expect when that happened, and it turns out that it is different than she expected. Binti Home ends with her finding out that her alien friend slash family is now in trouble. And so I assume that the last book, Night Masquerade, is going to be the wrap up and the conclusion of this larger overarching story of Binti. I definitely plan to read the third in the series. I really like this series. It's hard to get into a little bit, I would say, hard sci-fi. So if you are not a sci-fi reader, it might be difficult to understand some of the concepts and ideas that are happening, and that so much of it is set in space and different places. But it is also a story of like oppressive cultures and the different cultural clashes of people, and how maybe sometimes people are being bad, being oppressive, being colonizing different societies and things like that, but maybe it's just cultural differences that have kept them apart all this time, and communication, and how communication often leads to resolution in conflict. The Binti series to me is a little sparse in that, like, it is hard sci-fi, there is a lot of sci-fi details, there is a lot of details, but there's also some holes, like it feels a little rushed sometimes, which I don't mind for a novella series. All the books are pretty short. Binti is the shortest, then Binti Home, then the final book, and they are pretty obviously all one story. You can definitely read Binti on its own, but I don't think you could read Binti Home on its own as a standalone, and I don't think you could read the third book as a standalone. I don't know, there's something not quite fully connected about the stories and the overall plot lines. There's a lot going on, so I do think that this could be a more concise and like wrapped up series, but I also think that the inconciseness of it, the non-wrapped upness of it, lend to the vibe and the atmosphere of the story that Okorafor is trying to tell. I've read several Okorafors now, mostly short stories or novellas, and I really enjoy her writing. The next book that I finished in February was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. This is the second Toni Morrison book that I've read, and this is her first published work. This book was written in 1970. The Bluest Eye is about two young girls, Frida and Claudia, living in Lorain, Ohio, a small town in Ohio, with their fairly stable family in the, I would say, probably 1950s and 60s. And they are learning to navigate the world, learning about the world, coming of age at this time. Specifically, you see those aspects through Claudia's eyes. And then you also see their friend, Piccola, who comes from a very different background, a very different family dynamic, who has very different struggles than our two main girls. Piccola is friends with our two main girls, and through the three young children's story, we see all the struggles that Piccola and Piccola's family deal with, and just the community in general, how relationships work and how people are abused, how people are neglected, how people take pride in things or not, how they have disabilities or differences that they have to overcome or not. And it follows the story of these three girls. Mostly it follows the story of Piccola through our two main girls' eyes. But this book is definitely like broken up into a lot of different sections. There's kind of a beginning section which talks about Dick and Jane and uses the Dick and Jane model of white perfect family union to kind of set you up for what you're going to see in the rest of the story. And then the rest of the book is broken up into different seasons of life in Lorain, in this small town. But again, sometimes we see the Dick and Jane story come back into play. And one of the things that several of these children long for, but especially Piccola longs for, is to have blue eyes. She is considered an ugly child. She considers herself an ugly child, but she thinks that she would be wanted and loved, fulfilled, and beautiful if she had blue eyes. It jumps around in time. It talks about Piccola's father and his history, and her mother and her history, the young girls, other people in the town, some prostitutes in the town and sex workers, some different things that are happening all over. It it changes styles a lot. So there are times when we're in Claudia's head, where there are times when we are seeing things from afar. There are times at certain points in this where it reads like a biography. There are times when it reads all in dialogue. I think it definitely reads like a debut novel. I mean, obviously this is one of the most well-known Toni Morrison books. Her earlier works are more well-known and more well-loved than her later works, but this one I think is, touted as a great novel, but beloved is usually the novel that people really go to from her oeuvre of writing. And I think I can see why, this being a debut novel and this being a scattered novel and this having so many different styles, that it would be hard to get into. I definitely really enjoyed this one. I was so glad to read another Toni Morrison. I've been putting off reading Toni Morrison because it's a little bit intimidating. I've only ever read Sula, and this made me want to reread Sula because I remember Sula having some interesting literary devices and some interesting style aspects of it as well, but I don't remember exactly what they were. Sula is her next novel, so I think I'm going to go ahead and reread that soon, coming up at some point, just to try to compare and contrast these first two novels. If you love Toni Morrison, if you love Alice Walker, if you love Gloria Naylor, if you love, what are some of the other people? Zora Neale Hurston. Obviously you should be reading Toni Morrison. We should all be reading Toni Morrison in general. She's clearly a brilliant writer, even with a kind of scattered debut. The next book that I finished in February is Selected Poems by William Carlos Williams. So William Carlos Williams wrote one of my all-time favorite poems, which is called This Is Just to Say. I used to see this poem on the subway in New York all the time, and I loved it so much, and I've always wanted to read his work. He has written essays, he has written short stories, he has written epic poems, and this is a collection mostly of his shorter work with some excerpts from some of his longer epic poems. He was a New Jersey author, and he was a physician and a doctor, so he has a lot of stories about life and death, but this one definitely was not my favorite collection. I love that one poem, my all-time favorite poem, and I liked some of his other works, but as his work got longer and as this book went on, I just felt that it was too over my head. It was too nebulous. There was too many literary references to Greek gods and different mythologies, and also other classic works that I am not familiar with or that I didn't really get in context of these poems. I enjoyed a lot of them, and I definitely plan to read more of his work. I have a couple of other books of his, one book of his like short stories and essays about being a doctor, which I think would be really interesting, but it just felt like too intellectual, too flowery, too over my head, which is in stark contrast to my favorite poem, which is a very straightforward, short, obvious poem, but beautiful and emotional and connective, whereas I felt like a lot of his other work was just like beyond me, I guess. I am glad that I finally read this one. I got this book forever ago in Vermont. I mean, like 20 years ago, 25 years ago probably. So I'm super glad to have gotten to it, and I will be reading more of his work. So those were the first 6 books that I read in February, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is February 18th, and I have read 3 more books in February. The next book that I read in February was Our Lady of the Nile by Scholastique Mukasanga, and this was translated from the French by Melanie Mossner. This book I've been wanting to read for a while. I think it was on a short list for maybe the International Booker or something, and or maybe the Women's Prize. No, because that has to be written in English. I don't remember, but I know that I've wanted to read it, and then Brian at Bookish really likes Scholastique's work, so I thought I would pick this one up. I was also wanting to read a translated book by a Black author for Black History Month. Our Lady of the Nile is all about Our Lady of the Nile, which is a boarding school, prep school in Rwanda. This takes place prior to the Rwandan conflict and the Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi people, but we see events leading up to that point in history. It follows several girls at this boarding school and kind of all about the idea of missionaries and Catholicism coming into the country, about about how the girls are treated at this school and how they treat each other. So it's kind of a story told in little vignettes. I read this one on audio, so I don't physically have the book, so I don't know if it's actually vignettes, but that's what it feels like by the writing. Almost a collection of interwoven short stories, very similar to We the Animals by Justin Torres. You're definitely following all the same people, but you hop around a little bit in time. I mean, for the most part, it goes from when they were younger at the school to when they're older at the school, and it goes from kind of when they're young and innocent and just learning about, you know, different things and getting excited about things like one of the French missionary teachers being a hippie with like long hair, to leading up to this Rwandan genocide where, you know, some of the girls are turned against each other. People are turning in their neighbors to be murdered, to be slaughtered. People are taking sides, participating in this genocide, either through fear of their own persecution or through religious zealousness, believing that one faction of the population is lesser than the other. So it follows these girls and kind of their relationship and, you know, different things that happen, how they manipulate, how some girls get involved with older men, and how the church and the missionaries kind of have to navigate not only the different culture, but just young girls growing up, sex, and things like that. So, you know, it touches on girls getting their periods, it touches on girls getting pregnant, it touches on relationships between girls, it touches on, you know, like I said, having a crush on someone that's your teacher, things like that. As we learn about these girls, we learn about our main character, who we're reading from the perspective of, and how she is one of the people in the tribe, in the part of the population that's going to eventually be genocided, and how her fellow students think about her, and how the relationships between these students change when the politics change and when people are asked to turn in their Tutsi neighbors to be murdered, to be eradicated. Similar to, what's that one I read, Dogs of Summer. It has that true girlhood feeling, but then added in with the Tutsi genocide, added in with the Rwandan politics. It's like really shocking and grotesque, like that girlhood nature gets turned on its head and becomes this shocking and grotesque moment. So I really, really enjoyed it. I can't wait to read more. This was much, much lighter than I thought it was going to be. One of the reasons that I haven't read Mukasonga's work prior to this was because I thought it was going to be so difficult to read, so hard to read, hard to understand and comprehend, because the culture is so different to mine and I don't really know much about Rwandan culture at all. But more so than that, so much about abuse of women, abuse of the Tutsi people, abuse of just a more vulnerable population and things like that. And it was all about that, but it was a much lighter tone, a much easier tone to comprehend and to accept. I think that made it all the more like poignant and all the more of a stark contrast between where we start the book and where we end the book. So I really, really enjoyed it, and I would definitely highly recommend, and I can't wait to read more by this author. The next book that I finished in February was The Crazy Kill by Chester Himes. This is the second Chester Himes book that I've read, and it is the third book in the Harlem Cycle series. Chester Himes was writing in mid-century America, in New York, I think from basically like the, 40s and 50s. This was written in 1959 through to like the 70s. And if I recall correctly, he did not live too much longer than that. But this follows Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson, two black policemen on the beat in Harlem at this time as they get entangled in a murder. So just like the first book in the series, which was the first Chester Himes that I read, A Rage in Harlem, this is an interesting mystery novel because yes, it has Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed in it. And yes, we do see from their perspective sometimes, but like we see a lot more people's perspective and we know a lot more about what's going on with the mystery from various people. And we see those people outside of those two cops' perspective. So I think that's really interesting. They don't even show up until like a third of the way through the book in this one, and kind of the same for the the first book in the series. We're meeting all the cast of characters. We're meeting all the people involved in this crime. We're seeing the relationships between them. And what I think the first book did and what this book does is we're seeing the relationships that people have with Harlem. Like, Harlem is definitely a character in these books, which I love. I think it's so cool. There's a lot of talk of different streets and street intersections and areas and stores, specific stores. Like, this one features heavily a A&P supermarket and just things that you would know from living in New York and certainly living in Harlem at this time that you would recognize, even if they are just based on actual places, not actual places in the book. And then Coffin Ed and Gravedigger Jones come in, and they do eventually solve the mystery. And one of the reasons that they solve the mystery is because they understand how Harlem works. And it seems like from these two books that I've read that they often do use their cop smart and their street smart to solve these crimes, but more often than not, it happens to be luck that they chance into, that they kind of find the right suspect, yes, but also that suspect confesses for whatever reason or has other outside factors that are causing them to solve the mystery, to complete the mystery, not necessarily the pressure from Coffin Ed and Gravedigger. I love the series. I read book 3 because this was the book that I had, but I can't wait to collect the rest of the series and read the rest of the series. And this is definitely one that I could see myself rereading. These are so fast. There's so many characters. There's so much going on. They're so bingeable, readable that I already don't remember the mystery from the first one very well. So I think these would be a fun one to reread and reread in order because they do build on the characters as we go. There are things in this book that came up in the first book that happened, events that happened in the first book that we see the repercussions of in this book. So I think there definitely is an overarching story of some of our characters. And I have the feeling that because Harlem is such a tight-knit place at this time and such a community and the community is so much a part of these stories that we will see characters from different books coming in and out throughout the entire series, if I had to guess. So, can't wait to read more of these. Can't wait to find more and read them. The next book that I finished in February was a reread for me, and that is Claire DeWitt and the Bohemian Highway by Sarah Gran. So I read the first in this series, Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead, and this book way back when they were first published in 2013 or 2014, and I absolutely love them. These were the second Claire Gran books that I read. I think the first book I read was Somebody Returned to Saturn or something, which I did enjoy as well. And since then, I have also read Come Closer, which I loved. I've been wanting to reread the Claire DeWitt series. There are 3 books in this series, and actually there's a new collection of short stories featuring Claire DeWitt coming out in 2025, which I'm so excited about because I love Claire DeWitt. She is a holistic detective similar to Dirk Gently, and she bases her detection methods on this book that she and her friends found as a child that revolutionized their lives, totally changed their lives, and led all of them to become detectives. So this book also leads Claire to her mentor, Constance, and in the first book, we see Claire returning to New Orleans for a case several years after Constance has been murdered. That's kind of where we meet Claire, and Claire is never in a good place. Claire is always on the verge of a breakdown of some variety. She does a lot of drugs. She participates in a lot of destructive behavior, but since her mentor, Constance, passed away, she is even worse, but she's also the best detective in the world, and so she continues to take cases. In the Bohemian Highway, we see her back in the San Francisco area, the Oakland area, and we see her going all around California and Las Vegas trying to solve the case of one of her friends who has been murdered. This case definitely throws Claire into even worse disarray than she usually is in because this friend of hers is kind of the one who got away. So she is trying to use her normal holistic methods, teach her assistant Claude, and suppress all her emotions about her friend who has died. But I love this one. It was so great. And the ending of this one, the very, very end, kind of leads us into the next book. The next book didn't come out for like 10 years, or maybe less than that. Maybe it was like, I think it was like almost 10 years, like 8 years or something. And if I recall correctly, it starts exactly where this book leads off, but it is a much more nebulous and bizarre book. These books are a little bit stream of consciousness. They're a little bit dialect almost in their dialogue, because people talk the way you would talk, and punctuation is used in that way as well. And because Claire is dealing with grander holistic ideas in the world than we see in many books, these take on a very like mythical but magical kind of element to it. And these are books that like I feel like were written for me. Like these are my absolute catnip, and I love them, and I'm so glad to have reread The Bohemian Highway. And I definitely will be moving on and reading whatever the next one is. I have it on my shelves. Blacktop. That was definitely my least favorite in the series, but I didn't reread these books before I read that one, so I think having reread City of the Dead last year and then Bohemian Highway this year and then moving fairly quickly on to the last in the series will help me understand it better, and I'm looking forward to that. So those were 3 more books that I read in February, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is March 1st, and that means it's time to finish talking about all the books that I read in February and time to do our wrap-up of the wrap-up. The next book that I finished in February was Hard Dough Homicide by Olivia Matthews. This is number 2 in the Spice Island Bakery Mysteries, which is a cozy mystery series set in Brooklyn, New York. I think the area is called like Little Caribbean, Brooklyn, New York, but it's right around like Lefferts Garden, if you're familiar with Brooklyn, which is kind of to the southeast of Prospect Park, if you're not as familiar with Brooklyn. So I read this for the Savage Prompts, which was to read a book set in a city or region or state or place that you have lived for more than a year. And obviously I lived in Brooklyn for 15 years, so I thought this would be a good and easy one to do. I also was reading it for Black History Month, also because I had been reading a lot of heavy books and I wanted something like a little lighter and more fun. Nothing is more fun to me than a cozy mystery. So I did really enjoy this one. It is set all around the Spice Island Bakery, and we follow our main character, who is the younger daughter in the family who own this bakery, run this bakery. And in the first book, which sadly I could have read, but I didn't realize it was available on Libby, so I ended up reading the second one first. I do plan on going back and reading the first one at some point. But in the first book, someone drops dead in their bakery and our main character is accused of murder. In the second book, Hard Dough Homicide, against our main characters and her family's better judgment, the bakery opens on a day that they're usually closed to have a special event dinner, and while at the dinner someone is poisoned. They don't actually die in the bakery, they die later at the hospital, but our main character and her family have to band together and try to determine how this person was poisoned, why they were poisoned, who poisoned them, and why it happened at their bakery. And of course, some people at the bakery are suspected and the cops are called in, etc., etc. This has all the tropes of many cozy mysteries, like for instance that our main character's ex-crush from high school is the cop that comes to interview her all the time, and he is seemingly like kind of wanting to start something up with her, but she's not willing to do so because he keeps accusing her family and herself of murder. And then there's also kind of the trope of the tangential connections between people who get murdered and the bakery and her family. But there's also this great family dynamic because her parents and her grandmother run the bakery. They're together all the time, and there's a lot of talk of the bakery and how the bakery works and how these murders and bad publicity are affecting the bakery, which I thought was super, super interesting. This book will go in my list of books about the service industry, because there was quite a bit about like customer service and day-to-day operation of the bakery and finances of the bakery. So I thought that was super interesting. Overall, I think the mystery was kind of blah, and I really liked more the character dynamics and especially the family dynamics and meeting all these different family members and all this community of people. Whoa, Chippy got attacked. Chippy got attacked so rudely. Come back here, buddy boy. Yeah, and then there's extended family that come into play, and like that was my favorite part of this book. Like I said, I do plan on reading the first one because it is available on Hoopla, but I am trying to read my own TBR, so it probably will be a little while before I get to it. The next book that I finished in February was from my own TBR, but I currently don't have it. So I did this in January as well, and I think I'm gonna continue doing it, although I don't know how many other books there are to do this with. But in January, I read a book that I lent to a friend so that I could decide whether I wanted to keep it or whether I wanted to unhaul it. That book that I read in January, I'm definitely an unhaul, so I'm not interested if I get that book back. The book that I read in February is Rosewater by Tade Thompson, and this is for the first in the Wormwood trilogy. I've read one other book by Tade Thompson, which was The Murders of Molly Southbourne, and I absolutely love that book. It totally got me. Love it. Can't wait to continue on with that series. But I lent Rosewater, actually, and The Murders of Molly Southbourne to my friend Kai, and I haven't gotten it back yet, which is totally fine. Take your time. No rush on getting it back. But I wanted to read it to see if I wanted to continue on with the series or pick up the rest of the series if I ever found it, and to see if I would eventually ask for this book back. And I'm happy to report that I will ask for Rosewater back. I really enjoyed Rosewater, even though it was an extremely convoluted and confusing plot that jumps around in timeline. So Rosewater is about our main character, Carol, who is living in Nigeria, living around this place called Rosewater, which is a town on the outskirts of the city and in kind of rural Nigeria, where an event has happened that part of the world has been like closed off and kind of captured in like a bubble, and Rosewater is the town that has kind of emerged around the bubble. And we see Carol many years ago when this bubble, this dome, this disconnection of place first happens, and we see him today and how the events that created this bubble and created this dome affect him throughout his life. So Carol is one of the people who gained a sort of superpower from the bubble. It's unclear what the bubble is exactly and how the bubble works, but it is pretty well considered that the bubble is like alien life that came down and created this bubble. So sometimes like reanimated creatures emerge from the bubble, sometimes like aliens emerge from the bubble, sometimes people go into the bubble to be healed, sometimes they don't come back out, sometimes they do. And Carol was there kind of on the scene when it first happened, and it gave him these powers of being a finder. So Carol is a person who, as long as an object is like loved and cared about by another person, and as long as he comes in contact with that person, he can then go find that object. Whoa. When he first develops his powers, he uses them to steal things, to find lost money, or to find things that people have lost or don't know where they are or can do without, and he steals them for his own gain, basically, and to survive. But as the government in Nigeria and in Lagos find out that he's able to do this, they enlist him, and he's enlisted by both the government and kind of subdivisions of the government to use his special powers to find various things. And one of the main things that they want Carol to find is a woman who also gained powers at this time, who can kind of open rifts in time and space and hide people. That's the basic premise of this book, but it takes you a long time to get there, and it takes you a while to figure out what Carol's story is and what's going on with him, and it takes you a while to figure out what's happening in Rosewater and the various connections connections between all the different people involved. There's Carol, there's this woman that they're looking for with special powers, there's his handler, there's the person that introduced him to his handler, there's the government people, there's Carol's girlfriend, there's Carol's ex-girlfriend, there's Carol's mom, there's Carol's dad, there's, so there's a lot going on. And because this book jumps around in time quite often, not every single chapter, but quite often, it's really hard to distinguish, especially it was for me on audio, like what time period we were in and what was going on. And it took a long time for me to fully grasp the different time threads that we were following. I think if I had had the physical book with me, it would have been a lot easier because I could have referenced back to that and gone back to the beginning of the chapter because the headings of the chapter did tell you where you were in time. But when you're reading it on audio, it's kind of hard to keep going back, checking those timelines. I guess I could have just looked at the chapter headings on the audiobook, but you're doing other things, you're busy, so it was a little difficult. By the end of the book, I really enjoyed it. I thought Carol's journey as a person was really interesting. I really liked his character and the connections that he made with different people. And by the end of the book, you had some revelations about people in his life and what they were doing. You were worried about some of them. You were intrigued by some of them. You definitely wanted to know what else was going on. And then, of course, there's this overarching mystery of Rosewater in general and what came about and why these things are happening. So that also intrigued me and made me want to continue on with the series. So if I ever find any more of the books, I will definitely continue, or I might read some of them on audio. But like I said, I think it would be better to read them physically. So I definitely plan on asking for my copy back, maybe when I get the next book or maybe at the end of the year. And then I will probably keep this one at least until I read the rest of the series. The next book that I read in February was Quicksand by Nella Larsen. This is the second Nella Larsen that I've read. I've read Passing twice, and I love that book. It's completely amazing. It is set partially in Harlem, partially in Chicago, and so is this book. So Quicksand is often considered a loose autobiography or autofiction of Nella Larsen's life. It's about a young woman who is teaching at a college, I think in like South Carolina or maybe Georgia at the very beginning of this book, and she becomes very disillusioned with this black college and with the ideas and ideals of this black college, and she decides to move back to Chicago. She doesn't have any family except one uncle there. She's of mixed race descent. Her father was a person of color and her mother is from Scandinavia, from Denmark. But she's lost both of those parents, so she does have an uncle in Chicago. She goes there hoping to get money from him or live with him, but when that doesn't turn out, she's forced to look for a job, and then her searching for a job leads her to be introduced to a rich black woman who takes her to Harlem and kind of helps her along there. And then later her adventures or progress in life leads her to Denmark, to family that she does have in Denmark, and then that leads her back eventually to New York and eventually to Chicago. So it just follows her whole life. I think the crux of this whole novel is her disillusionment and her dissatisfaction with life. So I think it's really interesting that this is supposedly autofiction of Nella Larsen, because at each step and each progression of our main character Helga's life, she becomes disillusioned with whatever she's doing. At first at this college, and then by the rebuke of her uncle in Chicago and how she is not made to feel welcome there. She moves on to Harlem thinking she seemingly has found a place for herself, found a community, found a place where she feels satisfied, and then of course she's not, so she moves on and she moves on and she moves on, and right up until the very last page, in the very last sentence, we see Helga being disillusioned and dissatisfied with her life. So I don't think that's a spoiler to say, because like it's the whole point of the book in a way, but very much like Passing, the end of this book is not what you expect, is not shocking, but definitely carries like a twist or a turn or a punch, which I thought was really interesting. I actually had to go back and listen to the end a couple of times to make sure like I read it right. I will say that I read this book on audio, and the audio narrator was terrible. It's one of the worst audiobooks I have read. I'll try to remember to put whoever the audio narrator was. It's definitely an older narration, and it was just like very flat, very monotone, like very disinterested, which I guess could have been a choice because of Helga's journey, but it just really didn't work, I don't think. And I don't think it was good, and I don't recommend it. So I would definitely recommend reading this book physically. And it's one that I probably will eventually go back to. I don't think this one is as amazing or as excellent as Passing, but that's pretty hard to do because that book is incredible. So if you're new to Nella Larsen, I think I would read Passing first. But if you want to read more Nella Larsen, this does have her like very pretty and descriptive prose and really does evoke emotion in the reader. So if you liked Passing, you might like this one as well. I like this one just fine. The last book that I finished in February was Blackouts by Justin Torres. I found this book earlier this year. I've read one other Justin Torres, which was We Were Animals, which is kind of an auto-fiction of his early life being a Black queer man. And this is also auto-fiction, and it tells the story of a young Black man who goes to visit his friend Juan in some sort of medical facility. So we're never quite clear what the palace is, but we see this young man who sometimes calls himself Saul or uses the pseudonym Saul as his name. I'm not sure if he's actually ever named. His friend Juan is at the palace, and they spent some time in a mental health facility together, and our main character, we'll call him Sal, goes to seek out Juan as Juan is dying at the palace. So this book is all about Sal and Juan's relationship, and specifically it follows the last days of Juan's life and how Sal stays with him and learns from him. They tell stories to each other, and Juan wants Sal to work on this book that Juan has found, which is a medical examination of homosexuality that has been blacked out. So blackouts are in the book, and Sal starts reading this book, and Juan starts telling him about these volumes of books with all these blackouts that are kind of made to be like blackout poetry. And then as we learn about Sal and Juan, and as we learn about their relationship, the relationship that they've had to other people, as we learn about the people who created this book about homosexuality, this medical text about homosexuality, we find out more about the books themselves, about the studies themselves, about the people involved. We find out about Juan's life and also about Sal's life. It's a very like nebulous narrative. It's very much in the present day, Juan and Sal telling each other stories, this older man, this younger man. It's a lot about sexuality and gay sexuality. It's a lot about being a sexual creature or not being a sexual creature anymore as you're older. And it's about like kind of the medical phenomenon of queerness and also other things that back in the day were considered like mental illnesses. And so it also has a lot to do with mental health and what is considered now a mental illness, what was then considered a mental illness, and how these two men cope with their own mental difficulties and the difficulties in life. So super, super interesting. I really, really loved it. It really reminded me of Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which I think I read last year, just because the parts with Sal and Juan in the present day where we hear about what's currently going on with them are very untethered. They're very sparse. They're very unclear exactly what's going on, and it reminded me a lot of Invisible Cities, where we have Kubla Khan and Magellan, or whoever it was, the explorer, discussing the different cities. So we see Sal and Juan mostly sitting in the dark, mostly just telling these stories to each other, and then within the stories we learn about their lives, and they're told in many different ways. Sometimes they're told as if you're watching a film, sometimes they're told in reverse order, and so like they feel very magical, very timeless, very out of place. Also, in current day, you're feeling very untethered as well. because you're just seeing these two people in what feels like an empty room, essentially. So I really liked it. It was really interesting. It was very unclear how much of this is real. Obviously, some of it is real. The books that they talk about, the medical texts, are real. But are the blackouts real? It seems like Justin Torres invented those blackouts. Is the story of Justin, our main character, Juan, our main character, real? These are real photos, but are these really photos of things that he's talking about, or are these photos that worked within the story? Are these photos of the actual people? Is the story behind the medical texts real? The characters that they talk about, the people that they talk about, are real people, but did it really happen? So it's super, super interesting. It's very big brain in your head, like floating above your body kind of feeling, if that makes any sense at all. But I really liked it. And I think something that you could tell from the other books that I read by Justin Torres, and certainly by this one, is that he is a poet. That doesn't mean that all his stuff is super lyrical or super purple prose, but it does mean that everything is impactful. So it definitely packs a punch and is interesting, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I look forward to reading more Justin Torres for sure. I could definitely see myself rereading this one, and I absolutely could see myself looking for the books and the people who are mentioned in this book. Another thing that this book does that's super interesting, which I think would be amazing, and I wonder if anyone's done it, is it quotes books and stories so much. So there are a lot of quotes in here that mostly Juan says that are obviously from books. Some of them I recognize, but the vast majority I haven't. So I would love to see like a bibliography of all the quotes that Juan uses in this. Super fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And that was the 13th book and the last book that I read in February. So I read quite a few less books in February than in January, but that makes sense. I did read a ton of books for Black History Month, which was awesome. I'm always trying to read that. I read continuations of many series, which is super fun. I started a few series, which is less fun, but I recently did do a series tracker video, so you can go and look at all the series that I'm currently reading there. Since I'm tracking my translated works, I read 2 translated works. Oh, I read 1 book for Criminali's Wasted Weekend, which is the weekend version of Garbogus that he does in February. I read a cozy mystery for that, so I definitely think that counts. I think cozy mysteries are perfect trashy books, and we call them trashy books with the utmost respect, and I love a trashy book and I love a cozy mystery. 2 starts of a series, 4 continuations of a series, 10 books for Black History Month, 1 for the Wasted Weekend, and 2 translated books. I read quite a few books by authors that I have read from before, and a few books by authors that I've never read from before. So that was my month in reading. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know what the best book that you read in February was. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!